Hi there, and welcome to this month's Business Briefings. I'm Katia Popova, Director of Communications here at the Kogat School of Business. And today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Joseph Mortati. Professor Mortati is a beloved instructor here at the Kogat School of Business. He teaches information systems, operations, and project management. And he has an interesting experience that led him up to academia. Some of it includes flying fighter jets. Some of it includes IT consulting and owning his firm with that. And today we're actually not going to talk about either of those. Today we're going to focus on something that happened about 107 years ago. That was the sinking of the most famous ship of the time, or ever, really.
Most famous ship in history, yeah.
Titanic. And that is a story that's been told about 1,000 times. I've seen the Titanic about 7 times in theaters, and I don't even know how many more.
Yeah, spoiler alert, the ship sinks and Jack dies. Just
heartbroken. Thank you. But it's a story that we all think we know much about. It's a story we all think that we're experts on. Yet you saw an untold side of it. And I wanted to actually start us off today by taking a look at what that looked like. What piqued your interest, and what did you find about it that you thought has not been told in those 1,000 times?
Sure. Well, in the last 100 years, the story's been told from 3 mutually exclusive perspectives. So the first is, in the aftermath of the sinking, the view was that the ship was lost due to pride, that human beings put too much faith in technology and they believed that they could conquer nature. Yeah. And then the story was told from a perspective of greed. This large corporation made this giant ship, filled it with thousands of poor people, exploiting immigrants moving to the West. And then, since the wreck was discovered in 1985, it was told from a perspective of naval architecture and engineering, and some people have theorized that substandard materials, design, rivets, or testing were responsible for the loss. But I think in all 3 of those cases, the perspectives failed to realize that Titanic was fundamentally a business venture. And I realized that nobody had ever told this story. And what I found was I was in graduate school, and I was taking a course called Leadership and Organizational Behavior. And my professor, Dr. James Calvin at Johns Hopkins, he had us do a case study of decision-making under pressure, and he used the Titanic. And I was always fascinated by the story, how something so grand and majestic could fail so spectacularly. So I thought, I'm in an MBA program, I'm studying marketing and finance and operations management, and I'm wondering if any of that stuff applied. And the more I got into the story, the more I realized that far from being the greedy, prideful, poorly engineering fools that history has portrayed them to be, the decision makers were actually really smart people. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they made lots of arguably good decisions, not only the kind of decisions that we teach here at Kogat on a regular basis, but that a lot of businesses follow today.
And in your book, you actually talk a lot about the marketplace at the time and the parallels that you draw with something that you might experience nowadays, right?
Yeah, so it's interesting because at the beginning of the 20th century was a time of great promise and great change. So you had new communication technologies, primarily wireless, were making the world a lot smaller. The other thing that was happening is that new technologies in the area of transportation allowed safer, more effective and easier passenger transportation. So this led to an increase in demand. At the same time, there was also a mass migration of people, including my grandparents and maybe some folks in your audience. And at the same time, national governments sought to protect the interests of the companies that were headquartered in their own countries. So I don't know if any of that sounds familiar, but the parallels are really kind of striking.
And what would you say that the impact was of working within that environment, and how would you draw the parallels in terms of the decisions you might make today? Especially, I'm wondering, I'm a marketing professional. Can you relate that to a marketing strategy that you saw happen in the Titanic?
So there was some things that, again, it's the most famous ship in history that pretty much nobody really knows much about. So there was a couple of interesting facts, and then there was a really significant marketing technique that I want to share with the audience. So the first interesting thing I found out was the Titanic was the second of 3 identical ships. So there was Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, and I thought, well, that's kind of an important part of the story. How come I never heard that before?
Yeah.
And the second part was that Titanic was the pride of British shipbuilding and engineering, but she was actually owned by an American. And so she belonged to a company called the White Star Line, which is no longer in business. And that was in turn owned by a conglomerate called the International Mercantile Marine, or the IMM. And what's fascinating is the IMM was actually owned by J.P. Morgan. The J.P. Morgan owned Titanic, at least indirectly. And so the first good decision was to compete internationally by acquiring the best companies.
Yeah.
So there's basically two ways a company can grow. They can grow organically from within, or they can grow via acquisition. So Morgan's plan was to buy up the best companies, even if you had to pay top dollar for them, and take market share.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the really interesting marketing ploy that I just think is amazing is that Titanic and her sisters were, their original design called for only 3 smokestacks or funnels. And that was what was needed to support the engine configuration. And now they didn't have the concept of target marketing or focus groups like we have today, but they knew that their customers perceived that more smokestacks were better. And besides, their competition, the form of the Cunard line, which is still in business, their ships had 4. So the ships were delivered with a 4th funnel that was a dummy. It was a fake. It was put there for marketing purposes. If you've ever seen any pictures of the ship, there's no smoke coming out of the last funnel because it wasn't connected to anything. I think that's really, really good marketing. And the first rule of business is arguably you have to know who your customers are.
And speaking of customers, we've always discussed before that the Titanic had a very interesting approach of how they filled up their ship with customers in terms of how they maximize their profits, right?
Right. So there's 2 sides to the profit equation. There's the expense side and there's the revenue side. Yeah. And for somewhat detailed reasons that I get into the book, White Star's main competition, Cunard Line, they made a strategic decision to go with a radically new design for their new class of ships, and they wanted to compete on speed. Yeah. So to give you an idea of scale, they had the fastest ships in the world for 22 years. So what White Star had to do is they had to respond to this. Mm-hmm. And so because speed, you bump up against the law of diminishing returns. The faster you go, the increment you get is not worth it. Yeah. So what they did was they fell back on their traditional roots, and this is good decision number 2, which is to maintain a strong brand identity, and that was a luxury brand. So what's kind of really ingenious on their part was that even though their ships, the new class of ships, was about 40% larger than the competition, they had an extremely efficient propulsion system that actually resulted in an 11% less operating expenses. Mm-hmm. Now, on the revenue side of it, it doesn't matter the number of passengers you carry. It matters the amount of revenue you get from them. Yeah. And so back then, there was 3 classes of passengers. There was first class, which were people of means, and they tended to travel in both directions. Second class passengers tended to be tourists, but tourism is a seasonal business. Yeah. And then third class passengers tended to be immigrants. Yeah. But immigrants tended to travel one way. They tended to travel from Europe to the United States. And the other thing is that immigration is a cyclical business. Yeah. So they designed the ship in a way that even though they were about 50% bigger, they only carried 10% more passengers than the competition, mm-hmm. but they were designed to get 40% more revenue. So they had a much more lucrative passenger mix. The other thing that was interesting is when I recreated the financials, that was the most difficult part of the book, to recreate financials from 100 years ago. But their revenue distribution fell right in what's called the Pareto principle. Yeah. It's called the 80-20 rule. 80% of your revenue tends to come from 20% of your customers. Yeah. So the net of it was that every time one of their ships went on a voyage, it was going to cost them 11% less than the competition, and they were going to realize 40% more revenue. And that's a recipe for beating your competition head to head. Absolutely.
Now, you look at a lot of right decisions that they made. Operationally speaking, they were fantastic. Business model-wise, they were fantastic. And the premise of the book is that you can make a lot of very good decisions that can still lead to a very negative outcome. And one of the premises of the book is that you see how over time, good decisions build up tolerance for risk and some blindness to the accumulation of that. Do you want to expand a little bit more on that basic principle? Because I think that key takeaway from the book is how to be aware of that and how to calculate that into your operations and into your plans.
Right. So the title of the book is somewhat controversial. on the face of it. When I told people I was writing a book, they said, "Oh, great, what is it about?" I said, "It's about the business story behind the Titanic," and they all looked at me as if to say, "Oh, should we tell them that they were stupid and that's the wrong way to do it?" So what I learned from my consulting practice was that many companies, particularly large ones, they make decisions in isolation.
Yeah.
So you can have a series of individually good decisions that but actually is happening is you're accumulating risk in between them.
Yeah.
And there's something called a power law distribution, which is sometimes better known as a black swan event. And basically, unlike a normal distribution, the bell curve that most people are familiar with, is that you've got a wide range of probabilities for what happens, and there's a useful average. Well, it's very difficult by their nature. Black swan events are very difficult to predict, but by their nature, they're very rare. But when they do happen, it ends up being the potential is that they're catastrophic. And so what I found 7 individually good business decisions that were made over about a 10-year period. And what happened is that while they were making these decisions and running the company, they had a series of accidents. There were actually 3 very serious accidents with their ships, including one that sank, but there was no loss of life. And so my premise is that as you make a decision and you're faced with adversity, I would say, generally speaking, a company that survives adversity is considered a good thing. On the other hand, the problem is that it can lead to a been there, done that type of attitude. And sometimes what happens is that operational teams can have a very high tolerance for risk. So I go into detail in the book about the three accidents, but I want to talk about one of them that is, I think, the most interesting. So in 1907, there was a White Star Line ship called the Subic, and the crew makes a navigational error and she runs aground and she's stuck. They cannot pull the ship off the rocks. It's a relatively new ship. It hasn't been depreciated. It's only about 5 years into a 25-year life cycle. And so they've got a significantly bad financial decision to make. So the first option is that they can salvage the useful equipment off the ship and cut the rest up for scrap, in which case they would get pennies on the dollar. The second option is to file an insurance claim for what's called a constructive total loss. That is, the ship didn't sink, but it's no longer an asset because you can't make any money with it. As unbelievable as it may sound, they chose a third option. They took dynamite and they blasted the ship into 2 pieces. And the back part of the ship, which was about 350 feet long, they drove it in reverse over 100 miles back to port. They contacted the builder, Harland & Wolff in Belfast, Ireland, which is still in business, and they said, "We'd like to order some replacement parts for that nice ship you built us." And they built a new bow. They put the ship back together, and she served for another 35 years. So this idea that when you're faced with adversity, including a ship that sank, and you come through it, I think arguably we would look at that's a good thing. What they didn't realize is that within those decisions is that risk was building up, and eventually what happened was they had a black swan event when they hit the iceberg, and that turned out to be catastrophic.
And people thought she was invincible. You speak of that a lot.
Right. So the thing is that it wasn't the word that's often used is hubris. And hubris is a bad pride. It's not a good pride founded in accomplishment or actual effort. And so, generally speaking, engineering failures are failures of imagination. And, one of the things that they didn't ask themselves was, what's the risk from icebergs?
Right.
What's the worst thing that could happen? Because practically speaking, all the worst things that could have happened had happened with other ships, and they had been through adversity. And so what it came down to is, by the time the ship left on her maiden voyage, it was inconceivable that there would be a set of conditions or scenario that would result in the first 6 compartments of the ship flooding. It was absolutely inconceivable. And so my point was that they weren't blinded by pride. It's almost like they were blinded by the data, that they thought that they were too big to fail.
Interesting. Now, we've talked a lot about good decisions, even if they do lead to a bad outcome. Now, let's talk about some bad decisions, because you say that often. You get asked one question over and over again. And what's that?
Right. So in the live sessions I've done over the past couple of years, is the number one question that the audience asks me is, they'll say something like, okay, you're making a couple of good points, and I hadn't considered that before, but why weren't there enough lifeboats for everybody? I mean, that seems like such an obvious requirement that, you almost wouldn't have to think about it.
Yeah.
So I did some research on that, and it turns out that the law mandating the number of lifeboats hadn't been updated since 1894. So Titanic sank April 15th of 1912, so it was 18 years. Now, there's an inherent conflict of interest between profits and safety. So consequently, industries, certain industries, for example, like transportation is one of them, banking, healthcare, others, are heavily regulated. And there's something called the British Board of Trade, which is similar to the National Transportation Safety Board here in the United States. And they govern the number of lifeboats. So this was something that was known in Titanic circles. So, but I actually wanted to read the law.
Yeah.
So I went to the UK Archives online, and I found the Merchant Shipping Act of 1894. And on page 650, there's a table that tells you, based on the tonnage of the ship, the number of lifeboats you need. And what's really interesting is that the number of lifeboats was a function of ship tonnage, not passenger capacity.
Yeah.
And the table stops at 10,000 tons.
Yeah.
So it says 10,000 tons and up, you need 16 lifeboats. Well, Titanic was 46,000 tons. But because the regulations hadn't been updated in 18 years, which I know it seems like an eternity to us, but then as now, technology was moving faster than the regulators' ability to keep up. So even though Titanic could carry enough lifeboats for every person on the ship, she was only delivered with 16 because that was what was required by regulation.
And you do mention also that it's not so much that there were not enough lifeboats, but there was not enough time.
Right. So regardless, what ended up happening was, from the time the abandoned ship order was given to the time the ship sank was about 95 minutes.
Yeah.
So the limiting factor wasn't the number of lifeboats, it was the time. And in fact, all the lifeboats were launched. There were no lifeboats left on the ship.
Yeah.
And actually, the very last lifeboat was launched literally as the ship sank out from underneath it.
Yeah.
So having more lifeboats would not have made any difference in this case.
Now, this particular scenario draws some parallels to something that we've been witnessing lately in the news. You and I have discussed a little bit about what Boeing is facing right now with their latest 737. What would you say are the most stark parallels that you're seeing?
So let me do a little bit of backstory here, because the good decision number 4 in my book is reduce implementation risk.
Yeah.
And one of the ways you can reduce implementation risk is by taking an existing product or service and scaling it up rather than designing a new one.
Yeah.
So a little backstory going back to the Titanic story, and then I'll bring it to the present. So I mentioned that Harland and Wolff is a shipbuilder in Belfast, Ireland. They're still in business, and they were the main supplier in White Star's supply chain. And so by about 1890 or so, they had figured out how to build large steel-hulled ships that were sufficiently safe, reliable, and profitable to carry passengers. Yeah. And what ended up happening was, because of market demands, they needed bigger and more efficient ships, which is kind of what we're seeing. Well, maybe not bigger, but we certainly need today in airplanes. We need more efficient. And so what they did was, as their customers' needs increased, they took a good design and they scaled it up.
Yeah.
And in the book, I have a picture of what I call Titanic's family tree. And it was the ships that came before. And not only are the specifications being scaled up, they look very, very similar.
Yeah.
And basically, it worked out to about every 5 or 6 years, the ship capacity doubled.
Wow.
And so, again, why reinvent the wheel when you can take a good design and scale it up? Now, let's fast forward, or let's come back to 2011. So Boeing was faced with a decision. They had two choices. They either had to come up with a brand new design to replace the 737, which is about a 50-year-old design.
Yeah.
It's also the best-selling airliner in history. That's one option. The other option is they could continue to upgrade. So they had made a number of upgrades over the last 50 years. Yeah. So about the same time, Airbus, which is their main competitor, came out with a new version of their very popular A320. It was called the NEO, for new engine option. So Boeing's got a choice. what do they do? So apparently what happened was some of Boeing's best customers threatened to buy more Airbus instead of the Boeing. So again, responding to market pressures, Boeing took a good design, and they continued to, and they kept scaling it up. But this time there were some significant changes. So I think on the face of that, I think in that context, I think that's arguably a good decision.
Right.
The other thing is that by keeping it, it's still basically a 7.3. It's a new airplane, but technically it's still the old one.
Yeah.
So pilots don't have to get what's called a new type rating, and a lot of things stay the same. So the implementation, you're not only risking it on the hardware side, but on the user side. And in order to do so, because the aerodynamics were changed, they need to add some software. And I want to be clear, there's a lot of things that we don't know about what happened in the two fatal crashes, but it's clearly related to either the software or the user interface or training. It's probably a combination. But I think if you look back at it, I think if you went back 8 years ago and you're in Boeing's shoes and you say, well, we've got the best-selling airliner in history, we're scaling up a design, we're reducing our risk and all these kinds of things, I think it was probably inconceivable that they would miss something and it would lead to 2 fatal crashes. And now the worldwide fleet's been grounded for almost 2 months now.
And you said it was their most profitable plane?
Yeah, I think it's something like 30 or 40% of their problem. And they got orders, they built 10,000, they have orders for 5,000 more. So again, I mentioned I was always fascinated by the Titanic story, but it's not a history book. And at the end of every chapter, I basically distill what the lesson learned is from back then, put it in a modern context, and then ask the reader to ask themselves questions about how they're running in their own business.
Well, thank you so much, Joseph. I wanted to open that up to any questions that we may have online. No, we're good. Well, you're always welcome to send us any questions afterwards. We'll make sure that Joseph responds to those. Thank you so much. The book is called Collision Course. And I'm trying to make sure that I get the whole title right. How good business decisions stand the Titanic and why you're making the same mistakes. So we'll have a link to that book in our comments. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month.